Ever try to budget for like a weekend trip?
And the price of plane tickets just seems to bounce around more than a ping pong ball.
Oh, yeah.
One day it's a steal.
The next day, it's eating your entire vacation fund.
Right.
Well, that's just a tiny taste of the power.
The Federal Reserve has...
Yeah.
They can literally tweak the value of our money.
It's true.
Wild, right?
The Fed's decisions impact our lives in ways we might not even realize.
Which is why we're diving deep into this chapter from Mandate for Leadership
It makes the case for some pretty bold changes.
to how the Fed does its thing.
Yeah.
So consider this, your crash course in all things Fed.
Its history, its power.
And maybe even some potential tweaks to get this whole financial system humming along a little smoother.
This is a fascinating journey.
And it all starts with a crisis.
Okay.
Picture the early 1900s.
Financial panics were like those surprise fire drills in school. Nobody knew when they were coming.
But everybody panicked when they hit.
Banks were dropping like flies.
Oh, white.
People were losing their life savings.
Chaos.
Total chaos.
That's when the idea of the Fed
Is this stabilizing force,
emerged.
like a financial superhero swooping in to save the day?
Right. And here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
The U.S. back then,
Was a totally different beast.
it was
Imagine a world before smartphones,
before the internet.
before we were all glued to these things.
A majority of Americans lived in rural areas.
Their livelihoods tied to agriculture.
It really makes you wonder.
Does a system designed for that, America?
For farmers
I
and
don't know.
blacksmiths,
Blacksmiths
still makes sense in our world of instant transactions.
and global markets.
It's the million-dollar question.
And it leads us to a fundamental issue.
Some call the dual mandate problem.
Okay.
You see, the Fed is tasked with two huge jobs.
One,
Keep prices stable.
keep inflation in check.
Think keeping inflation from ballooning out of control.
Right.
And two
And maximize employment.
incredibly important goals. But are they even possible to achieve at the same time?
Whoa.
It's like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle.
It's a lot.
Trying to balance those two things feels like a recipe for.
Well, more of those economic fire drills we talked about.
It's a balancing act, that's for sure.
And some economists argue this dual mandate might actually be contributing to the very booms and busts.
The Fed is supposed to prevent.
Wow.
Almost like they're stuck in a constant game of economic whack-a-mole.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting.
Maybe even a little controversial.
Yeah.
Because this chapter argues...
But the Fed might have become a bit too big for its britches.
Oh,
Wielding a level of influence. That's
a tad concerning.
the question of the Fed's power.
And whether they've become too interventionist.
Too quick to step in and tinker with the economy is
Yeah.
a huge one.
And it's not just theoretical.
It's personal.
Okay, so bring this home for us
How do the Fed's decisions actually play out?
in our day-to-day lives.
Think about it.
Every time the Fed adjusts interest rates,
Or decides to pump money into the financial system, they're sending ripples through the entire economy.
those ripples impact everything.
Okay.
From the interest rates on your credit cards,
And mortgages,
yeah,
to you guessed it.
the price of groceries,
So we're all basically surfing the waves.
of the Fed's decisions.
Exactly.
Whether we realize it or not.
And this chapter dives into a specific example.
That really highlights this dynamic,
Okay.
the Fed's involvement in the mortgage market.
After the 2008 financial crisis,
Things were pretty wild back then.
especially in the housing market,
At where?
I vaguely remember hearing about all these mortgage-backed securities.
What are those again?
Imagine bundling up a whole bunch of mortgages.
From different homeowners
Uh-huh.
and selling them off as an investment.
That's essentially what a mortgage-backed security is.
Okay.
And after the 2008 crisis,
And again in 2020.
the Fed decided to buy trillions of dollars.
Worth of these things.
Trill.
We're talking serious cash here.
To put it into perspective,
Imagine the Fed pumping enough money.
into the housing market
Yeah.
to buy every house in several states combined.
Wow.
That's the scale we're talking about.
That's wild.
And the goal of all this buying.
Was to drive down interest rates,
Okay.
making it cheaper for people to get mortgages.
So on the surface, that sounds like a good thing, right?
Lowered interest rates.
Usually mean more people can afford to buy homes.
You'd think so.
But here's where those unintended consequences.
I'm going to play
Okay.
between 2020 and 2022.
While the Fed was busy buying up those mortgage-backed securities,
Yeah.
home prices in the U.S. skyrocketed.
By a staggering 42%.
Whoa!
That's not a normal market fluctuation.
That's a full-blown price explosion.
So cheaper mortgages.
But way more expensive houses.
That doesn't sound like a win for most people.
Exactly.
And it gets to the heart of this debate.
About the Fed's role. Because while they might have had good intentions,
their actions had some pretty significant consequences,
Right.
especially for anyone who wasn't already a homeowner.
it's like they were trying to help one group of people.
But ended up making things even harder for another.
Right.
And this chapter doesn't shy away.
From exploring some pretty radical solutions to these challenges,
Okay.
including the idea of abolishing the Federal Reserve altogether.
Now we're getting into uncharted territory.
I know, right?
It's a wild thought.
But is it completely crazy?
Let's find out.
All right, so we're back.
And about to dive into the deep end of Fed reform.
Abolishing it altogether.
Yeah.
I'll admit.
It feels a bit like suggesting we replace traffic lights with just hoping for the best.
It's definitely a radical proposal.
No doubt about that.
Okay.
But this chapter lays out a vision,
For what they call free banking.
and it's pretty mind-blowing.
Okay, so paint me a picture.
What does a world without the Fed even look like?
Do we all just start bartering chickens and potatoes again?
Not quite.
Imagine this.
Banks issue their own currencies,
Okay.
but these aren't just flimsy pieces of paper.
They're backed by real, tangible assets.
Wow.
Gold.
Maybe even other things like real estate or commodities.
What?
It's almost like your banknote could be exchanged for a piece of a gold bar.
Okay, that's a visual I can get behind.
Right.
So instead of a central bank calling the shot.
We'd have competition between these banks, keeping everything in check.
Exactly.
The idea is this competition,
Yeah.
this constant vying for your trust in your business,
Uh-huh.
would naturally prevent things like runaway inflation.
Or reckless lending.
It's a bold idea. I'll give them that.
But I can't help but think back to those financial panics.
We talked about earlier.
Right.
Doesn't competition sometimes lead to...
Well, chaos.
Sure.
Companies cutting corners.
Taking risky bets.
Yeah.
Ultimately crashing the whole system.
Those are valid concerns.
And this chapter doesn't shy away from the challenges.
Of such a radical shift.
Right.
It does mention a historical example.
The suffix system
Okay.
that offers the glimpse into how a decentralized system could potentially function.
But let's be honest.
Yeah.
Transitioning to a completely free banking system?
In today's world,
Yeah.
it'd be a monumental undertaking
It'd be like trying to rewire a supercomputer.
while it's still running.
Right.
So if abolishing the Fed is a bit too radical for most folks to stomach,
What about some other options on the table?
this chapter also touches on the idea of a gold standard, right?
Right. That's another hot topic in the world of monetary policy.
And it's appealing in its simplicity.
Okay.
Tie the value of the dollar to a fixed amount of gold.
Done.
Simple on the surface.
But I imagine it gets complicated quickly.
It definitely has its complexities.
But the core idea is that a gold standard creates a kind of self-correcting mechanism.
Self-correcting.
That sounds intriguing and slightly terrifying at the same time.
Think of it like this.
If the government goes on a spending spree, printing money like it's going out of style, their gold reserves start to dwindle.
It's like that moment when you realize you've eaten most of the cookies in the jar.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually, they'd be forced to rein in their spending.
Or risk depleting their gold entirely.
Yeah.
Which would make their currency essentially worthless.
So a gold standard acts like a kind of budgetary guardrail.
Forcing governments to be more fiscally responsible.
You could say that.
Of course, like any system, it has its potential drawbacks.
Right.
But it highlights a key aspect of this debate.
Finding the right balance between flexibility and constraint.
And this chapter doesn't stop at the extremes.
It delves into some more
Moderate.
practical reforms as well.
Oh,
Tell me about this K% rule.
it sounds like something out of Star Trek.
It's not quite as futuristic as it sounds.
But it does offer a compelling framework.
Okay.
Imagine a world where the Fed is bound by a simple rule.
They can only increase the money supply by a fixed percentage each year.
Like clockwork, for example.
Let's say that fixed rate is 3%.
Every year,
No matter what.
the money supply grows by that 3%.
No more, no less.
It almost sounds too simple.
Like, wouldn't unforeseen circumstances just throw a wrench in that plan?
What about those black swan events?
Sure.
Those economic curveballs that nobody sees coming.
That's the big question, isn't it?
And this chapter acknowledges that any rule-based system,
Will have its limitations.
right,
There are always going to be unexpected events.
unforeseen circumstances.
Yeah.
But the beauty of something like the K% rule,
Is its predictability?
okay,
It takes away the guesswork.
the potential for human error,
Uh-huh.
or even political influence.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal.
It's like setting the economy on cruise control.
Exactly.
Keeping things moving at a steady,
Predictable pace.
Of course, no system is perfect.
And the chapter dives into some alternatives as well, like inflation targeting.
Or NGDP targeting.
Right.
But the core message is this.
Reforming the Fed isn't about finding a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about understanding the trade-offs,
The nuances.
the potential consequences of each approach.
So what I'm hearing is
There's no easy answer.
no magic bullet.
Right.
It's more about informed debate.
Careful consideration.
And maybe even a bit of trial and error.
Absolutely.
And that's why this deep dive...
And this chapter in particular are so valuable.
Yeah.
They provide the knowledge
context.
and the different perspectives you need to engage in these critical conversations.
The future of our financial system.
Well, it's not just about numbers and policies. It's about all of us.
That's a perfect place to wrap things up.
If there's one thing we want you to take away from this deep dive,
it's that your voice,
your perspective,
matters in this debate.
It does.
So keep asking questions.
Keep exploring.
And most importantly,
Keep the conversation going.